Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Tonight, our focus over the next 1 hour is the government's ordinance amending the Land Acquisition Act. Now, you already know that it's met with a sharply polarized response. Industrialists and many economists have welcomed the amendment. The political opposition and several activists are sharply critical. So today, in a special program, we shall examine the many amendments in detail and hopefully ask and answer critical questions. Are the amendments justified, or is the criticism valid? Hopefully, an hour from now, you'll have a far better grasp of this key issue. Now joining me to discuss the Land Acquisition Amendment Ordinance is the well-known economist and chairman of Oxus Investments, Surjit Bhalla, the renowned activist and fighter for tribal rights, Medha Patkar, the founding chairman and CEO of Renew Power Ventures, Sumant Sinha, BJP National Executive Member Sheshadri Chari, and Congress MP and spokesperson Abhishek Singhvi. Surjit Bhalla, the ordinance amending the Land Acquisition Act does away with the consent clause as well as the social impact assessment requirement for land required for 5 specific purposes. And they are PPP projects, industrial corridors, rural infrastructure, affordable housing and defence. Now, in your eyes, is this a justified amendment, or is it designed to benefit a specific class of corporates, and therefore does that make it discriminatory?
Well, going backwards, if you think of a specific class of corporates as a government, then you're making the first mistake in trying to assess, because both government will acquire land and corporates will acquire land. Regarding the second issue, isn't it much better for the poor person, for the poor farmer, for the rich farmer who sells his land, that he actually be able to sell the land rather than be bogged down in this, forget red tape, this is sort of infinite tape that is bound such that no land transactions take place, and we have a land acquisition law which means no acquisitions. Okay. So I don't think anybody is hurt by the process, by the amendments that have been brought into place. This is actually, a lot of it will go into social infrastructure, will go into education, will go into hospitals, will go into roads. Now, unless we maintain that the poor people do not need hospitals, do not need roads, and do not need educational institutions, then you can go ahead and protest against the law.
Medha Patkar, in contrast to what you've heard from Surjit Bhalla, you firmly believe that the ordinance is designed to benefit corporate entities, and I think you've actually said that some of these are particularly close to Mr. Modi. So let me ask you, on what basis do you come to that conclusion, that they benefit corporates and those corporates are pro-Modi?
You see, second question is known to answer to the second question is known to everyone. Well, Mr. Adani earns 47,000 crores in 17 years. Who else but these kinds of big ones, the Ambanis and Adanis, benefit more than acquiring land because they are the new Jamindars. Whosoever they may be closer to, the point is that this particular ordinance is taking back the land acquisition process to the British legacy of 1894. And Mr. Bhalla is making a mistake when he is equating government projects with the private projects. First and the foremost, the British also said that the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 would not be used for acquiring land forcibly for the private companies, private projects. And that is the scenario all over the world. No other country has such act. And this particular act of 2013 brought in by UPA after much of people's protests all over the country did give only the democratic space to the farmers, fish workers, the laborers, the rural India, and that which is being knocked off.
That's been eliminated.
Yes, eliminated.
Mr. Chari, you're nodding your head in disagreement. How would you counter what you've heard from Medha Patkar?
No, two very quick things. You know, ironically, the very first act brought by the British, it is not just 1894, it is, the first act was 1824. The original
but let's
act
not go back into history.
And in 1824, the Britishers said the same thing. They said, we want to bring this act because we want to create electrification, railway and so many other things. But that apart, you know, there's one small thing. You mentioned defense and other things also. National security is one more issue that has been included here. And national security and also situations created
what about the point Medha ji makes that the beneficiaries, but yes, what about her point? The beneficiaries are the Adanis who are deemed to be close to Mr. Modi.
No, you know what happens is, after this ordinance, what has now happened is, all the land acquired by this under this act, these 13 acts which come under it, I'll read out just quickly.
No, we know that.
Highways, Metro, even Atomic Energy Act, Indian Tramway Act, Railway Act, Ancient Monument, all these acts. Now, if government acquires land, there was no compensation.
Mr. Chari, what you're forgetting, can I interrupt you? What you're forgetting is under those heads, Mr. Chari.
Now you get compensation, you get rehabilitation is assured, and resettlement is assured.
Chari,
because
what
of
you're
this
forgetting
ordinance.
is that many private companies can acquire under those heads.
You can't. No. Only under PPP if the land is vested in the government.
No, you're wrong. Forgive me. You're wrong.
It is there.
No, Mr.
Under PPP. Under PPP.
No, Mr. Chari, not just under PPP. Private companies operating in defense can acquire land.
The government has to acquire.
They're excused.
Sir, you read the act.
I have.
The land has to be vested with the government.
That's for PPP purposes.
No, even for defense.
No, you're wrong on that, but let's not quarrel over that. Suman Sinha, let me bring you in. The original bill of 2013, which has now been amended, required 70% consent for landowners for PPP projects and 80% consent from landowners for private companies. Now, after the amendment, if private companies are involved in defense, rural infrastructure or affordable housing, or if private companies locate themselves in industrial corridors, they won't have to abide by the consent clause and they won't have to abide by the social impact assessment clause. So clearly, in those 5 areas, private corporates will benefit. Leave aside whether they're close to Mr. Modi or not, but they will be beneficiaries in those areas. Would you accept that?
I would accept that in the context and relative only to the last Land Acquisition Act, which by itself was not necessarily a very robust act to facilitate further investments by the industrial sector. So I think relative to that, I agree with you, this act has facilitated a little bit more. But I think in the absolute sense, if you ask me, I think even this act is fairly onerous because it only excludes 5 or 6 different sectors that get this preferential treatment. And there's a whole host of other manufacturing industries that do not get that benefit, and where in fact the land acquisition process will still be 4 or 5 years long. So to that extent, if you ask me, I even think that this ordinance does not really fully do justice to what really is required to be done from a land acquisition standpoint, from the industrial standpoint.
In other words, as an industrialist, what you're saying to me is that in fact you need further amendments if you're really going to make land acquisition easy for industry and create the grounds for manufacturing, make in India, etc. This doesn't go far enough. You're actually saying that, aren't you, Suman Sinha?
That is absolutely right. That's what I believe, because at this point in time you've only got these 5 sectors in which you can actually go through a slightly faster process. And in almost every other sector, the steel, any other metal manufacturing, anything else. For example, if you want to set up a semiconductor factory, you want to set up a solar manufacturing area, all of those will have to go through the much longer land acquisition process. And so there are so many other businesses where, in fact, this ordinance will not really help them.
Come back, Abhishek Singhvi, to the original point that in these 5 areas where in fact the consent clause and the social impact assessment clause is exempted, private companies could benefit. Now, the truth is, practically each of these 5 areas, defense, rural infrastructure, affordable housing, are areas that benefit the economy. Industrial corridors does so particularly. Defense, in addition, benefits national security. So if private companies, by operating in these specific areas, end up getting benefits themselves, so what? They're providing a national service in return. And remember, what the Act does is not make it cheaper, it simply makes it easier to acquire land. Otherwise, industrial development could be impeded. How do you counter that point?
I think we are completely jumbling up the perspective, Karan. There is no need to amend the 1894 Act. In fact, thank God for small mercies. The previous speaker said we should go back to the 1824 Act perhaps. Why have we amended the Act? To make it more difficult to acquire easily, but to give proper balance to the rights of the landowners. Now you raised the very specific question of consent clause and social impact assessment for 5 areas. Do you have in this act before you, Karan, any definition of what an industrial corridor is? What a PPP is? Today, a hospital, a road, a metro, educational institution, a convention, a bridge, a convention center are all PPPs. Now, today, why do you make an escape clause without definition, which brings you to even identical 1894? Then why do you have an amendment at all? Why do you have a new law at all? Do you know, Karan, that an industrial corridor from Mumbai to Delhi
Can I stop you?
Just one second.
Let's not jumble up all the points together. I was asking you about private companies benefiting. Stick to that. I'll come to the others one by one. Otherwise, audiences won't understand.
I'm saying the private company benefit. First of all, Mr. Sinha is completely wrong in suggesting that, or Mr. Chari is completely wrong in suggesting this doesn't apply to private companies. It applies, it is meant for them, it is created for them. That's the first point. Secondly, it gives an exception supposedly in 5 areas which swallows up the rule. Today, an industrial corridor, it is estimated Delhi-Mumbai has a square kilometer area of 4.5 lakh square kilometers.
Yeah.
The whole thing is out. A PPP is what? Have you defined it? Anything and everything is the PPP.
Well,
so these 5 areas will swallow up the rule completely.
Okay, let me stop you there. I want to take these one by one because I think it's important for the sake of the audience who are otherwise befuddled by technical subjects that we take it one by one. Otherwise, we'll confuse them and this program will serve no purpose. Let's first, Sujit Bala, look at one of the exemptions, which is in fact hereafter under the new amendments, multi-crop irrigated land can be acquired for these 5 specific purposes. Previously, it couldn't. Now, many people feel this is going to have a direct impact on Indian agriculture, and more importantly, it will have a direct impact, and an adverse one possibly, on the interest of farmers. Do you think that this is one exemption that should not happen?
You know, this is a classic example. I'm glad you've brought this up as to how, if you will, confused and polemic the debate is, and we get into obfuscation by lawyers and everybody else. Let's take this issue of whether you can acquire double crop land. Well, all of Indian agriculture, you know, back in the 1930s and 1940s, it was a case that you didn't have double cropping on most of the land. Then came the high yielding variety revolution, and now it is a case that all the land in India, perhaps maybe some land on top of a mountain, that is not double cropped. Everything is double cropped. So what the old Congress ruling had in effect was that you cannot acquire any agricultural land. Forget anybody benefiting. You could not acquire land. In the name of the poor are not benefiting by the old Congress law. So therefore, this is an absolute necessity that you at least have some transactions take place. Why don't you ask the farmer whether he wants to sell the land rather than you stipulating that if it is double cropped, you can't sell the land? I mean, this is absurd.
Okay, you're one of the people who actually has objected to this particular exemption and amendment in particular. And let me put the opposite case to you. Most of Bengal qualifies as multi-crop land. If multi-crop land cannot be acquired for industry, industrialization in Bengal will virtually stop. Therefore, if you're going to give people a better livelihood by providing industrial jobs and providing them an opportunity to move from rural to urban, then you have to have this exemption and multi-crop land has to be acquired.
Karanji, first of all, let me correct the factual errors in many presentations. I think the Act should be read properly. The section 2 of the definitions of infrastructure, which comes from the Department of Economic Affairs, includes manufacturing industry. Mr. Sinha may be happy to hear that. But point is that infrastructure covers electrification to water projects to manufacturing industry to tourism, and also the housing for the poor includes the builder-prone housing schemes of the various governments. Second thing
I'll just stop you. So what you're saying is that the point Mr. Sinha made that the Act doesn't go far enough is not true. Your interpretation of infrastructure proves it does. Okay, come to your second point.
Infrastructure will include this Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor with 3,90,000 hectares targeted in the first phase itself.
Come now to the point I made about multi-crop land.
Yes, but now what is it that they are acquiring land for? The private company word is replaced by private entity. So even if it is a private education institution, no one says that we don't need that.
Let's take this one at a time, otherwise we'll confuse the audience. Stick first to my point. I'll come to private institutions and hospitals in a moment's time.
Okay.
Answer my point about your objection to multi-crop land being acquired. Why do you not accept the Bengal argument that if you do not let multi-crop land be acquired, you won't have industrialization in Bengal?
I think Sujit is wrong on this point. It is for the food security purpose, not only of the farmers, but everyone else who eats food and not chemicals or power, requires that the agricultural land, not only multiple crop agricultural land, to be saved. And it is not 100% even today. It is 20-25% at the most in each state. Also, there is lot of, in Maharashtra, 80,000 hectares of land acquired and not used.
Okay.
So why should industry not be, complementary to agriculture, where there is more of livelihood opportunities than the industries or SEZs give us?
Let's move.
No, out of 491 projects, 51,000 hectares of land, 40% of the land has been used. The rest of the 60% of the land which is being now put to industrial use was all under the earlier act. Therefore, these figures are wrong. Number one. Number two, as far as putting land to use is concerned, it's not only land acquisition, it is also capital formation, labor laws, infrastructure availability, water, power.
So
why do you require the agriculture?
So many other things are equally involved in this.
What you're arguing, in fact, that multi-crop land, please let him answer. Let's do it one by one so audiences can follow. You're arguing that in fact multi-crop land must be made available for acquisition, otherwise industrialization in states like Bengal will stop.
The act doesn't say multi-crop land must be made available. It only says
it can be acquired.
It can be.
Absolutely.
But when at the time of acquisition, what is to be determined is it for a purpose which is of greater public use and utility, or is it going to
the social impact clause has disappeared. Mr. Chari, you're getting confused. I'm stopping you. You're getting confused.
Multi-crop and two crops are again different.
No, Mr. Chari.
We don't have the figures.
Mr. Chari, I'm interrupting you because I'm afraid the social impact clause has disappeared in those areas, so they will not
only
be
in these areas. Only in this.
That's what we're talking about. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these areas.
No, only in this area. Number one. Number two.
Mr. Chari,
the most important aspect is these areas did not give any compensation or rehabilitation earlier.
No, Mr. Chari, you're confusing things. Forgive me, you're confusing things. You're confusing the 13 acts that are amended with the 5 specific areas where exemptions are given. You're running the two together.
No.
Yes, you are. Forgive me. I'm moving on. I want to move on and put another concern that's been brought up to you, Suman Sinha, and it's a critical concern, and it's to do with the fact that unfortunately the term industrial corridor is not defined. As the Business Standard in an article on the 7th of January pointed out, taking the example of the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, this one corridor is 1,483 kilometers long, and it has a band on either side of 150 kilometers. Altogether, the industrial corridor along this particular route will be 444,900 square kilometers. If you have 5 or 6 such industrial corridors, it's been estimated you're talking about anywhere between 10 and 14% of the entire land area of India. Now, is it justified that in such a vast swathe of territory, the social impact assessment clause and the consent clause should be waived? Because doesn't it then make a mockery of those clauses altogether?
No, I think that what the government has done is that it's given itself flexibility in terms of trying to make more land available for industrial activity. Now, I think we have to debate one issue, which is industrial activity always an antithesis to what India needs at this point in time in terms of further economic growth? The question is, if in fact an industrial manufacturing activity comes up somewhere, it actually does provide jobs to everybody in the neighborhood. It does create further economic development. So why do we have this belief that just by virtue of acquiring land, somebody is going to get so badly dispossessed that ultimately it is going to result in a much worse scenario?
Can I answer that?
I think that is something that we also must debate.
Can I answer that? You see, the concern that arises when the social impact clause is exempted is that you've undermined the key principle of prior informed consent. And the second concern that arises when the social impact clause is exempted is how do you then work out the compensation due to non-landowners? Now, both of those were integral parts of the original act. Both now, by exempting the social impact assessment clause, have been severely undermined.
No, that may be the case, Karan, but at the same time, I think how the social impact assessment clause would actually operate would in fact increase the time taken for land acquisition by a considerable amount, and also put further approval powers in the hands of various government entities. And that then you have to then take a decision whether you want to actually encourage industrial activity, because if this whole social impact assessment takes 4 or 5 years in terms of the sort of extending the land acquisition process, then you might as well tell industrialists that there's no point in actually putting up anything, because nobody is going to plan a project for where land acquisition takes so long.
You know, that's a very fair point.
So I think this whole concept has to be reworded and redone in some very fundamental manner.
You know, that's a very important point, Abhishek Singhvi, made there by Suman Sinha. And I imagine he speaks for probably all Indian industrialists who need land to set up their manufacturing plants. The original act made the process of acquiring land so cumbersome, so bound up with red tape, and so determined by the obstacles that lie ahead, that land acquisition became a problem. Now, maybe the government with their amendments have gone the other way, but clearly there's a crying need for a sensible, practical middle ground. Would Congress at least accept that you tied up industrialists in knots because of the number of cumbersome, prolonged procedures necessary, not just for the consent clause, but much more importantly for the social impact clause?
It's an important question. Let me answer it, Karan. Virtue always lies in the middle. Each extreme is always a vice. Now, the real issue is that if there were tailoring changes arising out of experience, minor changes of time period limitations, you could put a limitation that you must complete acquisition so much time, etc., etc. If there be no problem, it would be open to discussion. Of course, you have bypassed discussion, you have not given us a chance. And I am sure as a responsible opposition, the Congress would have partaked in that and agreed to it. The real point is the point you made a moment ago, which is that the heart and soul of the act is taken away in the name of an amending ordinance. You are having here, everything which you have read is being treated by my esteemed colleagues who talk of obfuscation by lawyers, obviously greater obfuscation by non-lawyers here, as a bar, as a prohibition. These are very superficial and shallow arguments. You could simply have a regulatory model.
Can I stop you? Can I stop you?
Put a time limit.
Tucked into your long answer at the very beginning was a willingness to meet halfway, if I understood you correctly. Are you saying to me that Congress would be happy to sit down with the government and say, look, there are some amendments necessary so that the cumbersome, prolonged and endless nature of the social impact clause is reduced, so that it doesn't become an obstacle to land acquisition, but please don't eliminate it. Are you prepared to take that route?
Unfortunately, what you say, Karan, would have been possible had the approach been different. You now have an act which is complete change.
You don't have an act, it's an ordinance.
Yes, you now have an act. At the time being, it's an act because the ordinance is the act. You have, without discussion, without an approach, without reaching out, without any of the things which you've said, a done deed. This can't be done like this. Yes, if you come back to the original and come to us by saying that, look, of course we are open, this tailoring is required, this patching is required. Somebody said, you stitched a whole new cloth.
You made your point.
You haven't come for, tailoring purposes.
You made your point. Let me bring in Mr. Chari before I take a break and come to other critical amendments that I want to discuss. There is half a hand being put out by Congress to try and establish a middle ground on this important issue of the social impact clause and the consent clause. They concede that it's a prolonged, obstructive process, but they want to retain it in a diminished form. Are you prepared to meet them halfway?
No, Congress is one of the stakeholders, but Congress is not the only stakeholder. We have to also ask the industry and other departments. We have also to take those. I mean, we cannot divide between development walas and anti-development walas. So there has to be a consensus evolved on this, even on the social impact assessment issue. But if a consensus has to be evolved, you have to evolve the consensus from what is available now, rather than going back
to what was interesting is that there's half a hand hesitantly held out by Congress, but not really fully, and there's a half hand from you, not really held out at all, because you believe other people have to be discussed. Yes. So there's the scintillating possibility of some sort of compromise, but it's only that and nothing more. It's probably more misleading than real. Let's take a break and come back and consider some of the other critical amendments, and in particular the clause.